Africa has tremendous business potential. I have so many friends going to your countries trying to get rich. I congratulate you. They're spending a lot of money. But it has a tremendous business potential and representing huge amounts of different markets. And for American firms, it's really become a place that they have to go, that they want to go. 6 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies are in Africa. Increasing American trade and investment across diverse industries, including agriculture, energy, transportation, healthcare, travel, and tourism, will further transform lives throughout the continent.
Imagine waking up one morning and seeing Wall Street on fire, not literally, but figuratively. Trillions of dollars gone overnight. The Dow Jones plunging faster than it has in decades. Investors panicking, CEOs calling emergency meetings, and the President of the United States pacing in the Oval Office with a look of disbelief on his face. What could cause such economic chaos? A war? A natural disaster? No, this time, it wasn't a missile strike or a hurricane, it was Africa. Yes, Africa, the continent the West has underestimated for centuries. In less than 24 hours, 10 African nations led by Burkina Faso, Mali, Ghana, and Niger announced they were halting all U.S. investments and suspending key trade agreements. Oil shipments stopped, mineral exports froze. Even agricultural contracts were canceled. And just like that, $5 trillion was wiped off the U.S. market. Panic spread across Washington. Phones rang nonstop at the Treasury Department. Lobbyists flooded Capitol Hill. The media called it the most devastating economic shock of the decade. But for Africa, it was a victory long overdue, act of defiance against decades of exploitation. For too long, Africa has been treated as a resource pit, a place where others come to dig, mine, extract, and leave behind poverty and debt. But this time, the script flipped. Africa said no, and not just one nation, 10 nations, moving together, united like never before. This is more than an economic story, it's a geopolitical earthquake. The U.S. has been trying to keep its grip on Africa for decades, using aid packages, military bases, and diplomatic pressure to control the flow of resources. But now, those same resources, gold, oil, lithium, cobalt, are being leveraged against Washington, and it's working. Inflation is creeping up. Tech companies are warning of supply chain collapses. Farmers are worried about fertilizer shortages. Every sector of the U.S. economy is feeling the shockwaves, and the question no one in Washington wants to ask out loud is this: if Africa can do this once, what happens if they do it again? Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just about money, this is about power. For the first time in modern history, Africa is proving that it can move markets, topple economies, and force the most powerful nation on earth to come to the negotiating table. So buckle up, because what you are about to hear is not just a story, it is a warning, a roadmap, and perhaps a prophecy of what is coming next. The entire world woke up to financial chaos unlike anything seen since the Great Depression. Screens across Wall Street were glowing red, stock tickers plummeted, traders shouting frantically into phones, and anchors on every major news network were struggling to explain what had just happened. In just 24 hours, over $5 trillion in U.S. market value had evaporated, and the cause was not a war. Not a pandemic, not a natural disaster, but a collective decision by 10 African nations to halt all new U.S. investments. Yes, you heard that right. 10 sovereign African states, Burkina Faso, Mali, Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, South Africa, Kenya, and Algeria stood shoulder to shoulder and announced that, effective immediately, they were suspending all new American investments, freezing joint ventures, and reviewing all existing deals with Washington and U.S. corporations. This was not a negotiation tactic. This was not a threat. This was a full-scale economic rebellion, and it was coordinated down to the hour. At 7 a.m. in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim stood before the cameras, flanked by his cabinet, and delivered the first blow. His statement was short but devastating. Burkina Faso will no longer allow foreign investments that exploit our people and strip our resources without fair compensation. All new American investments are suspended. Our land, our gold, our cotton, they will no longer serve interests that do not serve Burkina Faso. 30 minutes later, Mali made its announcement, then Ghana, then Nigeria. By midday, Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, South Africa, Kenya, and Algeria had all followed suit. Each statement carried the same message: Africa is no longer open for exploitation. The response from global markets was immediate and violent. Shares of major U.S. corporations with heavy African exposure, from oil giants like Chevron and ExxonMobil to agribusiness firms like Cargill and Archer Daniels Midland, collapsed within hours. commodity futures were thrown into turmoil. The price of gold, cobalt, lithium, and even cocoa soared as investors scrambled to secure supply lines outside Africa. In Washington, the panic was palpable. Donald Trump, back on the campaign trail and positioning himself as the savior of the American economy, was blindsided. At an emergency press conference, he lashed out, calling the move an economic attack on the United States and demanding immediate consequences. His words were meant to project strength, but behind closed doors, White House aides described a scene of pure chaos, frantic calls to African leaders, emergency meetings with Wall Street executives, even discussions of military options to secure U.S. assets abroad. But it was too late. The decision had already been made, and there was no going back. This was not a spontaneous event. It was the result of months, perhaps years, of quiet coordination between African governments, business leaders, and strategic allies outside the West. They had watched as their raw materials fueled the growth of Silicon Valley, as their oil kept Western economies running, as their cocoa, coffee, and cotton lined supermarket shelves. While their own people remained poor, enough was enough. Behind this historic decision was a secret summit held in Addis Ababa 2 months earlier. At that meeting, the leaders of these 10 nations signed what is now being called the African Sovereignty Accord, a pact to protect Africa's resources from being drained without fair trade terms. It was an economic revolution disguised as a trade negotiation, and its first test came with the bold suspension of American investments. The West never saw it coming. For decades, they had assumed Africa would remain fragmented, each nation negotiating alone, vulnerable to pressure, sanctions, and threats. But this time was different. This time, Africa spoke with one voice, and that voice was loud enough to shake Wall Street. In Lagos, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu declared, "We are not against partnership, but we will not accept a relationship built on dependency. America has benefited from our resources for decades. Now we demand respect, equality, and fair exchange. If that means slowing down U.S. investments until we get a better deal, so be it." In South Africa, President Ramaphosa echoed the same sentiment. "Our minerals will not leave this continent at prices that impoverish us while enriching others. We will negotiate as equals, or we will not negotiate at all." The symbolism of this united front was almost as powerful as the economic impact itself. For years, Washington had relied on divide-and-rule tactics, playing one African nation against another, offering military aid to one while sanctioning another, dangling investment promises to keep leaders compliant. But now, those tactics were useless. When one nation said no, 10 others said no with it. For Trump, the timing could not have been worse. With elections looming, he had promised to revive American manufacturing, secure supply chains, and put America first. Instead, he was now facing empty factories, skyrocketing commodity prices, and a Wall Street bloodbath, all triggered by African nations deciding they would no longer play by America's rules. In the hours after the announcement, protests erupted across Washington, New York, and Chicago. Farmers demanded answers about skyrocketing fertilizer prices. Auto manufacturers warned that cobalt shortages would halt electric vehicle production. Tech giants like Apple and Tesla saw their stock prices tumble as analysts warned of major supply chain disruptions. And yet, in Africa, there was celebration. In Ouagadougou, people flooded the streets chanting, "Our resources, our future." In Lagos, students marched carrying signs that read, "Africa is not for sale." In Addis Ababa, the African Union building was lit up with the colors of all 10 nations that had taken part in the decision. This was not just an economic move, it was a psychological one. For the first time in living memory, Africa was not reacting to the world. Africa was forcing the world to react to it, and the reaction was fierce. Within hours, U.S. lawmakers were calling for sanctions, trade restrictions, and even military intervention to protect U.S. interests. The Pentagon released a statement saying it was closely monitoring the situation. NATO held emergency consultations. But none of it changed the fact that $5 trillion had been wiped out in a single day and Africa was holding firm. The message was clear. The era of cheap African labor and cheap African resources was over. The world could either pay a fair price or look elsewhere. This was just the beginning. Africa had thrown the first punch in what might become the most significant economic realignment of the 21st century. The following day, the White House Situation Room was in crisis mode. Advisors sat around the table, shuffling papers, monitoring live updates from Wall Street and commodity exchanges around the world. The air was thick with tension as President Trump stormed into the room. His face was red with frustration. He slammed his fist on the table and barked, "How did we let this happen? How did 10 African nations coordinate such a move without us knowing? Who is advising them? Who is behind this?" National Security Advisor briefed him quickly. "Mr. President, intelligence suggests this was not a spontaneous action. This has been coordinated for months. China, Russia, and India have all been engaging heavily with African nations in closed-door sessions. They've been pushing for a new resource-sharing framework that cuts out Western intermediaries. We believe this is part of a larger geopolitical realignment. Trump didn't want explanations. He wanted results. I want options now. Sanctions, tariffs, asset seizures, whatever it takes to bring them back to the table. We can't just sit here while $5 trillion vanishes into thin air. This is war and economic war, and we're losing. But here's the problem. For the first time, Washington's usual playbook didn't work. When they tried to threaten sanctions, Africa didn't flinch. When they warned of cutting aid, Africa simply said, "Keep it, we will trade with others." When they offered backdoor deals to individual leaders, no one broke ranks. The unity was astonishing, and it terrified Washington. In Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi, there was quiet celebration. For years, these nations had been telling Africa that the West could no longer be trusted. Now Africa had acted on that advice, and the result was devastating for Washington. Analysts across Eurasia called it the beginning of the African century, a moment when the balance of economic power started to tilt away from the West. And this was not just about economics, it was about psychology. For generations, Africa had been treated as a junior partner in global trade, a place to extract minerals, to outsource cheap labor, to dump surplus products. But by halting U.S. investments, Africa had sent a message. We are not a junior partner. We are not a pawn. We are players, and we are changing the game. Markets continued to tumble. American investors scrambled to diversify away from African exposure, but there was no quick fix. Lithium from Mali, uranium from Niger, cocoa from Ghana, cobalt from the Dar Sea, these were not luxuries. These were the backbone of America's tech, energy, and food systems. Without them, factories slowed, costs soared, and inflation began to spike. The media went into overdrive. Some commentators called Africa's decision reckless. Others called it a wake-up call for America. But across the global south, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Latin American leaders praised Africa for standing up to neo-colonial economics. Middle Eastern leaders invited African representatives to discuss new trade routes and investment strategies. The BRICS bloc moved quickly to formalize a new Africa-led development fund, offering favorable loans to replace Western financing. Meanwhile, Captain Ibrahim gave another address, one that electrified the continent. He said, "America is shocked because for the first time, Africa has said, no, we will not be exploited. We will not be divided. Our gold, our oil, our land, they are not for sale to those who disrespect us. We are building a future where Africa negotiates as Africa united, proud and free. And let this be a warning. We will not go back." His speech went viral, translated into dozens of languages, shared millions of times across TikTok, Instagram, and ex-African youth rallied behind it. Protesters gathered outside U.S. embassies, holding signs that read, "Fair trade or no trade." The West tried to sow division, but this time Africa stayed solid. In fact, several more nations, Senegal, Zimbabwe, and Angola, announced they were joining the investment freeze, bringing the total to 13. The pressure on Washington grew unbearable. Trump tried a charm offensive. He offered a new Africa investment summit, promising mutual benefit and respectful partnerships. But the response from Africa was clear. Respect is not promised, it is proven. They demanded real concessions, better trade terms, local processing of minerals, technology transfers, and an end to exploitative practices. For the first time, Washington had no choice but to sit down and listen. The U.S. economy could not handle a prolonged standoff. Automakers, semiconductor producers, and agribusiness giants were lobbying Congress day and night, warning that supply chain paralysis could lead to mass layoffs. And so, after weeks of tension, a new deal was struck not on America's terms, but on Africa's. The agreement included fair pricing for minerals, commitments to build processing plants in Africa, and a guarantee that a percentage of profits would stay on the continent. It was historic. For the first time in over a century, Africa was not simply exporting raw wealth, it was shaping the terms of global trade. Brothers and sisters, this moment will be remembered as the day Africa stopped waiting for permission. 10 nations stood together and said no to exploitation, no to one-sided deals, no to being treated as second-class players in the global economy. And because of that decision, the world was forced to listen. Trump may have panicked. Wall Street may have trembled. But Africa stood tall. And in that 24-hour window, $5 trillion vanished from U.S. markets, proving that Africa's choices carry weight, real weight. This is not the end, this is the beginning of a new chapter. The African Sovereignty Accord has shown us what unity can do. If 10 nations can shake the global economy in a single day, imagine what 54 can do tomorrow. The message to the world is clear. Africa will no longer be the world's mine, farm, and dumping ground. Africa will be the world's partner and equal, a leader, a builder of its own destiny. To the youth of Africa, this is your call to action. Build, innovate, protect what is yours. To the leaders of Africa, stay united. To the people of the world, take note the sleeping giant has awakened, and its roar will not be silenced. The future is no longer written in Washington, Paris, or London. The future is being written in Ouagadougou, in Lagos, in Nairobi, in Johannesburg, and the ink is African.